It began in the middle of a sentence. Jasmine Crockett leaned forward, her voice steady, measured, carrying the weight of experience and conviction, and then cut. Ted Cruz's voice sliced through the air like a blade, sharp, dismissive, deliberate. He didn't wait, didn't listen, didn't allow, he interrupted. The room stiffened. Crockett's words hung unfinished, suspended between defiance and silence. Her eyes, calm and unyielding, locked on Cruz. There was no flare of anger, no breaking composure. Instead, there was a quiet fire, like a trial lawyer staring down a hostile witness. The tension felt less like politics and more like a courtroom showdown where the stakes were not one person's argument, but the dignity of an entire community. Cruz leaned back in his chair, smugness wrapped around his tone. He wanted control. He wanted dominance. Every interruption was not just about silencing Crockett, it was about silencing what she represented, the grit of a new generation, the pride of marginalized voices, the resilience of those who refused to bow. The cameras captured every flicker of expression, every twitch of frustration in the room. For the audience at home, it wasn't just a debate, it was a performance of arrogance against composure. You could almost hear the collective gasp ripple online as viewers typed furiously, hashtags already forming, memes waiting to be born. And yet Crockett didn't rush, she didn't raise her voice. She sat, breathing, waiting, letting the moment stretch longer than Cruz intended. That silence was louder than any outburst. It was the silence of someone who knew her power didn't come from talking over others but from standing taller than their arrogance. This was not the first interruption, nor would it be the last. But something about the electricity in the chamber told everyone watching that a collision was inevitable. Cruz had set himself on a path of repetition, each cut off a beat in a dangerous rhythm. Crockett was letting him dig deeper, letting him build the rope with which he'd eventually tangle himself. 6 times he tried to silence her, but the 7th, that was his mistake. Because on that 7th interruption the room would shift, the air would change, and the very power Cruz believed he owned would begin to collapse around him. Why did this moment matter so much? Why did a single hearing, one more clash in the endless swirl of Washington politics, strike such a nerve? Because this was not just another argument. It was a collision of values, a test of whether dignity could withstand arrogance in the most public arena of all. The hearing itself was meant to be procedural, the kind of dry political theater most Americans ignore. But the atmosphere had been electric even before Cruz leaned in with his interruptions. It wasn't just Crockett versus Cruz, it was a proxy war over what kind of country America was becoming. On one side stood the politics of bluster, of showmanship designed to dominate headlines. On the other stood a voice rooted in community, in lived struggle, in the quiet conviction that truth does not need to shout to be heard. Cruz, with his Ivy League polish and decades of political survival, represented a familiar force, entrenched power that thrives on drowning others out. Crockett, younger, fresher, unshaken by the pageantry of Washington, carried into that room the weight of something different, a generational demand for respect. To Cruz, this was performance. To Crockett, it was personal. The stakes went far beyond parliamentary decorum. For every viewer who had ever been interrupted in a boardroom, dismissed in a classroom, talked over in a family argument, Crockett's silence under fire felt achingly familiar. It was as if, in that committee chamber, she embodied the struggle of millions who knew what it meant to fight for a voice in spaces that weren't built for them. Each time Cruz cut in, the tension ratcheted higher. Social feeds began to flicker alive. Clips circulated before the hearing was even adjourned. Outrage grew not because of one man's arrogance but because people recognized a pattern, they had lived it. And they needed to see what Crockett would do in response. That is why this wasn't just politics. This was identity, this was dignity on trial. When a senator attempts to bulldoze through a congresswoman's words, it isn't just one person being silenced, it is the story of America's silencing and resistance, replayed on loop. The audience leaned forward, sensing that something bigger was unfolding. The hearing had become a stage, the chamber an arena, every interruption a drumbeat of escalation, and still Crockett did not break. That composure, that restraint was itself a weapon. It was patience sharpened into a blade. The crowd online, the viewers at home, the people who would later share and repost and argue, everyone was waiting. Waiting for that one turn in the story when the person who had been interrupted too many times would finally seize the microphone, not just to speak, but to transform the room. And so, as Cruz pushed harder, the stakes only grew. This was no longer about one exchange, one committee session, one headline. It was about proving whether arrogance could go unanswered or whether dignity, steady and unflinching, could rise above. What no one knew in that moment was that Cruz himself was setting the stage for his undoing. With every interruption, he stacked the tension higher, built the silence heavier, handed Crockett the perfect storm of outrage and anticipation. And when the seventh interruption came, all of that pressure would explode. The chamber would never be the same. To understand the weight of what unfolded in that chamber, you have to know the man who set it in motion. Ted Cruz is no stranger to confrontation. In fact, he thrives on it. To his supporters, he is sharp, unflinching, a relentless debater with a knack for theatrics. To his critics, he is something else entirely, a politician who mistakes bluster for brilliance, who confuses arrogance with strength. From the very beginning of his career, Cruz built his reputation not on collaboration but on combat. Princeton, Harvard Law, a rising star who marketed himself as a master of debate. His resume gleamed, but so did his ambition, often blinding him to the very people he claimed to represent. Time and again he showed a taste for the spotlight that bordered on obsession, inserting himself into battles not to seek truth but to claim airtime. Americans remember the government shutdown of 2013, when Cruz stood for hours on the Senate floor reading children's books, basking in cameras while millions of families bore the brunt of political gridlock. They remember his fiery speeches that soared on soundbites but stumbled on substance. They remember his fumbled exit from the 2016 presidential race, a man booed off the Republican National Convention stage by his own party. And they remember, with a mixture of outrage and disbelief, his hurried flight to Cancun in the middle of a devastating Texas blackout, while his constituents froze in the dark. This is the man who sat across from Jasmine Crockett, a man who has made a career of interruptions not just in hearings but in the very functioning of government itself. Cruz knows that in Washington the camera is always rolling and every clash is an opportunity. His strategy has long been the same: dominate the space, rattle the opponent on the moment. If the truth is drowned out in the process, so be it. But arrogance has a cost. The more Cruz leans on interruption, the more transparent his tactics become. Viewers can see when a senator isn't asking for clarity but for control. They can feel when someone isn't debating in good faith but cutting off to score points. That's why the interruptions of Jasmine Crockett didn't just look like politics as usual, they looked like something deeper, something uglier. Because Crockett wasn't just another colleague, she represented everything Cruz underestimated. She was younger, black, a woman unapologetically outspoken. In his interruptions there was more than impatience, there was the echo of a long history of voices like hers being dismissed, ignored, talked over. Cruz may not have said it outright, but his behavior carried that resonance, and America noticed. What Cruz didn't realize in that chamber was that his playbook no longer worked the way it once did. The age of social media has rewritten the rules. Every smirk, every sneer, every cutoff was clipped, uploaded, replayed in slow motion. Where once interruptions might have shown dominance, now they revealed insecurity. Where once bluster could intimidate, now it exposed fragility. And fragility is exactly what Cruz tried to mask with every loud word. His interruptions were not strength, they were shields. Shields against a rising generation of leaders like Crockett who don't play the old Washington games. Shields against the discomfort of facing someone who refuses to be intimidated. He had spent decades building an image as a fearsome debater, a man who could outtalk anyone. But in the age of Crockett, silence would prove louder than his noise. And arrogance, repeated 6 times over, would not strengthen his case, it would shatter it. Because with each interruption, Cruz wasn't weakening Crockett, he was weakening himself. The room could feel it, the viewers at home could sense it. His reputation, once formidable, was becoming brittle before their eyes. He thought experience alone would protect him. He thought the weight of his title and his years would guarantee him control. But what he didn't see, what he couldn't anticipate, was that the very arrogance that built his career would be the same force that cracked it open. And so, with every interruption, Ted Cruz wrote the prelude to his own undoing. What he believed would silence Jasmine Crockett would instead amplify her voice. The 7th interruption would not be his triumph, it would be his mistake. To truly grasp the power of that moment, you have to know who Jasmine Crockett is and why silencing her was never going to work. She's not a politician born of privilege, not a figure who glided into power on name recognition or family wealth. Crockett's story begins in the places too often forgot, neighborhoods where resilience is not a choice but a way of life, where people learn early that every victory must be fought for and every voice must be earned. She grew up watching inequality not as an abstract policy debate but as a daily reality. Schools that struggled for resources, families who worked themselves to the bone only to come up short, friends caught in cycles of injustice that seemed unbreakable. Those experiences planted something in her, a determination to push back against systems that kept people down. That determination became the compass of her life. Law school sharpened that compass into steel. She didn't choose the easy path, the lucrative path, the path of comfort. Instead, she built a career defending those who could not defend themselves. In the courtroom, she was relentless, standing beside clients society had cast aside, demanding fairness where fairness had been denied. Every case she argued was more than legal work, it was a piece of a larger battle for dignity. By the time Crockett ran for Congress, she was already seasoned by real struggle. She had seen injustice up close and refused to look away. Her campaign wasn't about slogans crafted in boardrooms, it was about the raw conviction that representation matters, that leadership means standing in the storm, not ducking from it. And when voters sent her to Washington, they weren't just sending another politician. They were sending a fighter forged in the fire of community struggle. That fire followed her into the halls of Congress. While others measured their words for political safety, Crockett spoke with a clarity that came from live truth. She didn't posture, she didn't pretend. She carried into that chamber the voices of those who had been ignored, silenced, or dismissed, which is why Cruz's interruptions stung so deeply for those watching. They weren't just watching a senator talk over a congresswoman. They were watching history repeat itself, power talking over justice, arrogance talking over truth. And yet Crockett didn't flinch. That calm stare she gave Cruz in the middle of his interruptions, it wasn't passive, it was power distilled into its purest form. It was the composure of someone who has stood in tougher arenas than a Senate hearing, someone who has faced louder bullies than a grandstanding senator. It was the look of a woman who understood that silence, used with precision, can be more devastating than shouting ever could. Her resilience had been tested too many times to be rattled by theatrics. She had already fought battles where the stakes were measured not in headlines but in human lives. The interruptions were annoying, yes, but to Crockett they were also familiar, just another attempt to drown out a voice that refused to stay quiet. And that familiarity became her weapon. Because every person watching who had ever been cut off, every woman who had been talked over in a meeting, every black professional who had been underestimated in a room full of power, they all saw themselves in her composure. Crockett wasn't just defending herself, she was carrying them too. That is why her restraint mattered. Her silence was not surrender, it was strategy. She let Cruz interrupt again and again because she understood something he didn't, the power of patience. Each time he cut in, he handed her more credibility, more moral authority, more of the audience's sympathy. He didn't realize he was building the very stage on which she would deliver her blow. Crockett's journey had prepared her for this. She knew what it meant to be dismissed. She knew what it meant to be underestimated. And she knew that when the moment came, she could turn those dismissals into strength, those underestimations into firepower. So when Cruz barreled forward into his seventh interruption, he believed he was in control. He believed he was breaking her rhythm, but in truth he was stepping directly into the trap of his own arrogance, because the Crockett sitting before him was not just another colleague to silence. She was the culmination of every courtroom defense, every community battle, every door knocked during her campaign. She was unshakable, immovable, ready. And when she finally chose to answer, not in haste, not in anger, but with precision, the entire room would feel the weight of her journey. The patience she had carried all her life was about to become her greatest weapon. 6 interruptions had built the tension, but it was the 7th that would reveal who Jasmine Crockett the first time Ted Cruz cut her off. It was almost predictable. A raised voice, a dismissive wave of the hand, the kind of routine interruption that too often defines congressional hearings. Crockett stopped, measured him with her eyes, then tried again. But before she could finish, the second interruption landed, louder this time, as though volume itself could erase her words. By the third, the room shifted. Staffers glanced at each other, eyebrows arched. The audience could feel it too. This wasn't about clarifying a point. This was about domination. Cruz leaned into his role like an actor in a play he had performed too many times. Each time Crockett attempted to speak, his voice crashed down like a hammer, forcing her to pause, forcing her to hold her tongue. But silence was her shield. Each interruption that Cruz thought weakened her only hardened the perception that he was spiraling. Crockett sat straighter, her expression unwavering. She gave him no outburst, no visible crack in composure. The more he pressed, the calmer she appeared. By the 4th interruption, whispers had begun in the chamber. Even allies of Cruz shifted uncomfortably. The optics were terrible, a powerful senator cutting off a younger black woman mid-sentence again and again as if her perspective held no value. Cameras zoomed in, capturing the contrast, his animated gestures, her steady poise. The narrative was writing itself. The 5th interruption felt like déjà vu, except now the tension was thicker, heavier. Crockett's voice began to carry an edge of steel. She spoke slowly, deliberately, making it impossible for Cruz to claim misunderstanding. Every word she managed to get out landed like a brick, building the foundation for something bigger. Still, he interrupted, unwilling to let her finish. And then came the sixth. The chamber itself seemed to exhale in disbelief. 6 times he had chosen to bulldoze through her words rather than engage with them. 6 times he had revealed not only his strategy but his fear that if she were allowed to speak uninterrupted, the strength of her argument would eclipse his theater. The audience at home was seething. On social media, clips of the interruptions were already ricocheting across timelines. Outrage hashtags bloomed like wildfire. Viewers weren't just watching a political clash. They were watching a replay of their own experiences, being cut off in meetings, dismissed in classrooms, overshadowed at dinner tables. Cruz had inadvertently tapped into a universal frustration, and Crockett, in her restraint, had become the vessel for it. But Crockett was not finished. Her silence wasn't surrender, it was the gathering of storm clouds before the strike. With each interruption she let Cruz dig himself deeper, let him expose himself not as powerful but desperate. She knew the chamber was watching, she knew the country was watching, and she knew her moment was coming. By the time Cruz prepared to launch his 7th interruption, the tension was unbearable. The rhythm of arrogance had set its own trap. The chamber bristled, waiting, almost willing Crockett to finally unleash what she had been holding back. 6 interruptions had built the suspense, each one raising the stakes higher than the last. The 7th would not be just another cutoff, it would be the breaking point, the moment everything flipped. And when it came, the silence after would be louder than anything Cruz had ever spoken. T really was, and why Ted Cruz had just underestimated the wrong woman. The 7th interruption landed with the weight of inevitability. Cruz leaned forward, voice sharpened with impatience, eager to seize control once more, but in his rush to dominate he missed the shift in the room. By now every ear was tuned not to him but to her, every camera was waiting for her response. The interruptions had exhausted their novelty, the arrogance had overstayed its welcome, and Crockett, calm and unbroken, was ready. She didn't meet his volume with volume, instead she let his words collapse under their own force. She paused, her silence deliberate, drawing the air tight around them. Cruz finished his sentence, expecting to barrel into the next, but Crockett's eyes held him still. It was the kind of gaze a lawyer gives a witness who has just sealed their fate without realizing it. And then she spoke. "Senator Cruz," she began, voice low but resonant, "you've interrupted me 6 times. 6 times you thought stopping my words would silence my truth, but the truth doesn't need permission to exist, it doesn't need your approval to matter." The chamber froze, even Cruz, so quick to interject before, stayed silent. Crockett continued, her words measured like precise blows. "You can talk over me all you want, but that won't erase my record. It won't erase my service. And it will not erase the people I represent, people who are tired of being silenced, tired of being ignored, tired of being treated as though their dignity can be cut off mid-sentence." A ripple went through the room, staffers shifted in their seats. Viewers online leaned closer to their screens. This wasn't just a rebuttal, it was a dismantling. Crockett wasn't sparring with Cruz, she was indicting him. "You see, Senator," she pressed on, "this chamber is supposed to be a place of debate, of ideas, of solutions, but what you've shown here is something else entirely. You've shown the arrogance of interruption. You've shown the theater of power for power's sake, and you've reminded every single person watching what it feels like to be dismissed." Cruz tried to smirk, but it faltered. Crockett's words carried the sting of lived truth, the kind of authenticity that no rehearsed talking point could withstand. "My degree," she said, pausing for emphasis, "may not impress you. My background may not mirror yours. But my record fighting for families, standing up for communities, working for people who never had a voice in rooms like this, that record speaks louder than your interruptions ever will." The chamber fell silent, a silence so heavy it felt like a verdict. For once Cruz had no interruption ready, no clever retort to claw back control. His weapon, arrogance, had been turned against him, exposed as weakness. And Crockett was not finished. "America doesn't need louder voices," she said firmly. "America needs stronger truths, and the truth is this: dignity will always outlast disrespect, service will always outshine showmanship, and justice will always outlive arrogance." It was not just a defense, it was a declaration. A statement that transcended the chamber and reached into living rooms, offices, classrooms, and phones across the country. For those watching, Crockett had become more than a congresswoman in a hearing. She had become a symbol of resilience, of poise, of the power that comes when you refuse to be rattled. The tension broke not with Cruz's words but with the reaction of those around them. Gasps, muffled chuckles, even the subtle shake of heads from those who knew they had just witnessed something irreversible. The cameras caught it all, the flicker of embarrassment across Cruz's face, the steel of Crockett's posture, the unspoken acknowledgement that the balance of power in the room had shifted. And then came the pause. Crockett let the weight of her words linger, refusing to fill the silence with anything less than their full gravity. That silence was cinematic, almost theatrical, the kind that pulls the audience forward, daring them to breathe. Cruz shuffled in his seat. He muttered, half-hearted, but the sting had already landed. No rebuttal could erase the image of his dominance crumbling under Crockett's composure. The room erupted, not in applause, for protocol restrained it, but in energy. Online, it was a different story. Hashtags ignited, clips exploded across feeds, memes were already being born with captions like, "She shut him down on the 7th. The flood of validation was instant and unstoppable. But in that chamber, Crockett didn't bask, she didn't gloat. She simply sat back, steady and unyielding, as though she knew this was never about winning a moment, it was about affirming a principle. For Cruz, it was the unraveling. For Crockett, it was the crystallization of everything her journey had prepared her for. And for America, it was a reminder that arrogance might dominate a room for a moment, but truth, calm, relentless, unapologetic truth, always reclaims it. What happened in those few minutes was more than a counterattack, it was a reversal of gravity. The senator who believed he controlled the narrative had lost it entirely. The congresswoman who was meant to be silenced had seized it, wielded it, and owned it. And when the chamber finally exhaled, everyone knew the story had changed. 6 interruptions had built the arrogance, the 7th had destroyed it. But the real shock was not confined to that room, because outside those walls the ripple had already begun, one that would stretch far beyond Capitol Hill. The question was, how far would it go? The clip hit social media before Cruz had even shifted in his chair. A staffer's phone, a journalist's live tweet, a congressional aide's hurried upload. Within minutes, the world beyond that chamber was watching, and they weren't just watching, they were reacting. At first it was a trickle, a handful of retweets, a few fiery captions. "She shut him down. This is how you handle arrogance." But like sparks on dry grass, the moment caught. By the time the hearing moved on, hashtags were climbing the trending list. By the time Crockett walked out of the building, the wildfire was raging. Millions were replaying the silence, that sharp moment when Cruz's interruption backfired and Crockett's words cut through like glass. It wasn't just political junkies passing it around. It was teachers sharing it in group chats saying, "This is what I feel in staff meetings." It was young women on TikTok lip-syncing Crockett's takedown, adding captions about their own battles to be heard. It was immigrants and first-generation Americans posting in pride, writing, "This is why representation matters." The comment sections became confessions. People spoke of being cut off, dismissed, underestimated, and finding validation in Crockett's composure. The moment wasn't about Congress anymore. It was about every classroom, every office, every kitchen table where someone had been silenced. Mainstream outlets scrambled to catch up. Clips ran on evening news segments packaged as the viral clash. Pundits tried to spin it. Was Cruz simply being forceful? Was Crockett playing to the cameras? But the spin couldn't keep up with the raw power of the footage. The optics were undeniable, one man's arrogance meeting a woman's unshakable truth. Progressive commentators celebrated it as a defining moment. Conservative voices fumbled between dismissal and deflection. But for the public, the verdict was already in. Crockett had won not by shouting louder but by standing firmer. And in living rooms across the country, parents replayed the clip for their kids. "Watch this," they said. "This is what strength looks like." In community centers, organizers wove her words into speeches about dignity and voice. Even late-night comedians picked it up, looping Cruz's interruptions for laughs before freezing on Crockett's stare, the stare that said everything without a word. Every viral moment has its peak, the second it transforms from trending clip to cultural touchstone. For Crockett, that peak was captured in a single meme, her poised expression, Cruz mid-interruption with the caption, "Go ahead, dig your own hole." It spread faster than any pundit's analysis ever could. But beneath the humor and the hashtags lay something deeper. Viewers weren't just entertained, they were inspired. Crockett's restraint, her clarity, her refusal to bow to arrogance had tapped into a hunger for leaders who could rise above chaos, who could model strength without cruelty, who could show that justice doesn't always roar, it can also stand firm and unshaken. For Cruz, the fallout was brutal. The interruptions were replayed as a montage of arrogance, a study in political overreach. Headlines framed him as rattled, exposed, undone, and while his supporters tried to rally behind him, even they couldn't drown out the viral soundtrack of silence that had turned against him. For Crockett, the moment wasn't about ego, it was about resonance. She didn't need to declare victory. The people did it for her, elevating her response into something larger than one clash in one chamber. It became a parable, a rallying cry, a viral reminder that sometimes the most powerful weapon against arrogance is composure. And as the clip continued to race through feeds, one question lingered in the minds of millions. If this is what happens in a single hearing, what could happen if voices like hers were amplified even louder, even further? The internet had crowned its victor, but the story wasn't over. The viral wave was only the beginning, and the ripple was about to crash against the shores of American politics in ways no one could ignore. When the chamber finally emptied and the headlines quieted into their second news cycle, one truth lingered. This clash was never just about Cruz and Crockett. It was about something deeper, something etched into the American experience. 6 interruptions had revealed arrogance, but the 7th revealed resilience. And that resilience, calm, steady, unshaken, spoke louder than any outburst ever could. Crockett's choice to remain composed was not weakness. It was a declaration. In refusing to descend into the same chaos Cruz embodied, she proved that dignity itself is a weapon. Her silence, her measured words, her refusal to let arrogance define the terms of engagement, those were acts of defiance more potent than shouting could ever be. For those who watched, the lesson cut across politics. Immigrants saw their own struggles mirrored in her restraint. The endless interruptions, the fight to be heard, the constant pressure to prove worth in a room that wants you small. Women recognized it too, the all-too-familiar dismissal, the demand to speak twice as carefully for half the respect. And for young people watching, it was proof that the world can try to shout you down, but composure and truth still carry weight. There was a moral clarity in the moment that no partisan spin could touch. Cruz had power on paper, his title, his platform, his volume, but Crockett held power in principle. And in America, when principle collides with posturing, it is principle that endures. The moral was simple, but it reverberated. Dignity is strength, service is greater than ego, and truth, when spoken without fear, cannot be silenced. Crockett's performance wasn't about theatrics. It was about integrity. She didn't win the clash because she shouted louder, she won because she trusted that her calm would outlast his bluster. For those who shared the clip, the moment became a kind of anthem. It wasn't just entertainment, it was validation. It told viewers that being cut off does not erase your worth. It reminded them that arrogance always unravels in the face of patience and truth, and it showed that even in the harsh theater of politics, character still matters. In the end, what people carried with them was Cruz's interruptions. It was Crockett's steadiness. What they remembered wasn't the noise but the silence that followed, the silence in which his arrogance collapsed and her strength became undeniable. And as the story spread, so too did the moral: you don't always need to roar to win. Sometimes the most powerful statement is the refusal to bow, the insistence on standing tall even when the world tries to push you down. But there was one final question, one that pulsed in the minds of millions who had watched this moment unfold. If dignity could prevail in this chamber against this arrogance, what could it mean for the larger fight for the country itself? That was the cliffhanger America was left with. Not just a viral moment but a challenge. 6 times he tried to silence her. On the 7th he silenced himself. That's the story America just witnessed, and it's a story bigger than one senator, bigger than one congresswoman, bigger even than that chamber. It's the story of arrogance crumbling before dignity, of noise collapsing in the presence of truth. But here what matters most, this wasn't just Crockett's victory, it was ours. It was every immigrant told to wait their turn, every woman spoken over in a meeting, every young voice dismissed as inexperienced. When she held her ground, she held it for millions. When she refused to be rattled, she became proof that resilience is not only powerful, it is unstoppable. And that's why moments like this matter. Not just for the headlines, not just for the viral clips, but for what they remind us. America is still a place where composure can defeat cruelty, where service can outshine ego, where dignity can still stand taller than arrogance. If this moment shook you, if it lit something inside you, don't let it stop here. Share this story. Tell it in your own words. Carry it to your communities, your families, your classrooms, your workplaces. Let this not just be Crockett's defense against interruption, let it be your reminder that your voice deserves to be heard too. And if you want to see more stories where arrogance collapses and dignity prevails, stay with us. Subscribe, share, and be part of this movement, because this isn't the last time the powerful will try to silence the truth. And when it happens again, we'll be here, telling the story, amplifying the voices, and reminding the world that resilience always wins in the end.